Hi all, welcome to our second online module. This module is on discourse analysis, which might sound scary at first, but I think hopefully going through this and doing the readings and seeing the examples, you'll see that this can be quite an effective methodological tool and one that uncovers some interesting phenomena that can happen in classrooms and outside of classrooms. So the first thing we want to talk about is what is discourse analysis? So discourse analysis is ultimately grounded in the study of language. And those who do discourse analysis take a broad view of what language is. So we could think of language as saying, the verbal words that are spoken between individuals or by one person and maybe not getting a response. But we could also see language as doing. So how do I use language to do something? So I use specific language practices to order from a restaurant versus ask for help via the telephone, calling some sort of customer service. I use different language in terms of how I am doing one action over another in terms of teaching. So how might I be working with a small group versus a large group? And then we can also think of language as being. So how does our language ultimately contribute to who we are as an individual? And we can think about that as, the best example I can think of is think about being at a teacher party and then think about the people who are at that party who are non-teachers and how the language we use really communicates who we are as professionals and ultimately as our identity. So James G. talks a lot about discourse as identity. Those language practices not only just communicate words themselves in our interactions, but it also communicates this sense of being. So ultimately then, discourse analysis is the empirical study of language in use. So how is it used in particular social and cultural contexts? So whether that be in the classroom, whether that be with an after-school group, if we think about these in educational spaces, it's this empirical look at how language is actually being used. And we can look at it in two ways. We can look at it as being descriptive, so we're trying to figure out what's going on, and analyzing the language, whether it's again saying, doing, or being, but analyzing that language as just simply what is happening. But there's also a branch of discourse analysis, and you'll see this in the Rebecca Rogers piece if you choose to read that piece, that it's critical. So some people engage in what's referred to as critical discourse analysis, where the emphasis is on really examining the power relationships that exist between groups and individuals and how language uncovers that. So I like this sort of researchy quote about what discourse analysis is, that there are a number of divisions and distinctions that have been drawn to explain the ways in which discourse is analyzed, meaning there's no one right way to do this and there's no single way to do this, but the simple distinction that might be helpful is that you could divide it into three domains. One, people might be looking to study social interactions, and so they're looking at the language to figure out what those social interactions are. So for example, how are boys and girls interacting in particular small group situations during guided reading groups? Or it could be used to study minds, selves, and sense making. So how are we using language as a window into one's cognition? Or third, it's the study of cultural and social relations. So we might really be looking at this more broadly about how classroom cultures or the culture of a school or the social relationships between teachers and students or student to students are really more holistically coming together. Not just the social interaction in the class, but ultimately what does it mean to be, let's say, for example, a striving reader? Or what does it mean to be labeled as a remedial reader in this particular context? So you might think of discourse analysis along those three lines. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, this is really grounded in lots of sociocultural theory. Vygotsky of all saying that language is the tool of all tools. Language is the way we mediate our experiences in the world. And in doing so, then we really have to analyze language. And I like the way G frames this a little bit differently. He just says, look, language is the way that we make our world and also the way that we break our world. So if we're not studying language, we're not really studying how we are and act and be and do in the world. So some considerations to look for in terms of reading, and again, as if you're considering using discourse analysis to study students or for your research project. But some things to consider is you could break this down into 4 ways: that you're focusing on language and literacy events, so that these are not just isolated utterances of words, um, but there's actually what Brian Street talks about as literacy events. That these things are imbued with all the social meaning, the cultural meaning, the language meanings, the reading that's happening, all those things going on. We might think about if we're trying to analyze a social event. So again, whether it's a guided reading group or recess or any of those things, but we're looking at the social aspect of that as opposed to really focusing on the words or the language. Or we could more discreetly be looking at the language practices or the literacy practices. But a couple of things to really consider is that nothing is ahistorical or asocial. So we need to consider the social context, the historical context, and I would say even the space itself. So when conducting a discourse analysis, it would be really helpful to draw a map of the room. So are the desks arranged in rows? Are the desks arranged in tables? Are the desks arranged in a horseshoe? Because all of that is going to impact the discourse that happens. And something that people like David Bloom and G and others really focus on is that any sort of discourse process always involves power relationships. So I know that earlier I said that you could have descriptive discourse or critical discourse, but some might say there's always a level of criticality involved in discourse analysis, because any language exchange is ultimately, there's a power relationship going on, and that's one of the things that discourse analysis can do for us. A couple things also to think about. So then what are your units of analysis? So when you start to capture the discourse, and then what researchers do is then they actually transcribe word for word what's happening. They have special codes if there's overlapping talk. There's special codes if someone stops their sentences and are interrupted by someone else. They might also capture gestures. They're waving their hands wildly while talking or sitting very still. And so they capture all of that into what's called a transcript. And then when analyzing that transcript, what is the unit? Is it at the sentence level? Is it at the idea unit level? Is it at the turn level? So let's say we have a group of 4 students, and student A says 4 sentences, and then student B interjects and says 2 words, and then student C interjects and says 3 words, and then the teacher comes in. What are we counting as the unit of analysis? Is it turn by turn? Do we want to go basic idea, basic idea? Those are decisions that are made by the researcher, especially as related to their research question. But also important, and as you're looking at analyzing these studies, also validity, because we don't want this just to turn into the researcher's interpretation, but there has to be grounded in some sort of validity. And so G, in his book Introduction to Discourse Analysis, talks about validity occurring on using 4 criteria. One is convergence. So do we see convergence happening across transcripts? So there's recognizable patterns that emerge. It's not just happenstance. It's not just that aberrant case. Second, do we have agreement? And so agreement can happen in a couple of ways. Do we see agreement, again, sort of like convergence, where we see things matching up, but also, let's say we're doing a member check and we start to retrospectively interview one of the students. Would the student agree with that analysis of that transcript? And then coverage, does this actually capture? Is this comprehensive enough? Does this cover what the typical language events would happen in a particular social or cultural event? And then lastly, the linguistic details. And this gets into the real nitty-gritty, but the analysis of the grammar and the grammar in use and the actual ways that language is structured and used. So whether someone's using African American vernacular English or using standard academic talk, or it's more of a just conversation, that the researcher pays attention to specifically how language is used, and that matches up with the way those typical language patterns occur overall. So it's grounded in other studies as well. So there's some advantages. One, discourse analysis illuminates issues, problems, patterns that are not as easily observed. So if we were just doing an ethnography and just trying to capture what's going on and taking field notes, some of those power relationships might not be as evident if we weren't looking really specifically and zeroing in on the discourse. And ultimately, then you might say that discourse analysis also seeks to uncover those power disparities, which can lead to more just and equitable educational spaces. Some of the disadvantages, it is more interpretive, so more painstaking attention to detail needs to be used and also explained in the write-up that show that one is making valid conclusions and not just their own interpretations. You are relying on what is spoken and gestured and not what is in the head. So I think this points to the importance of triangulation, perhaps member checks, sometimes, and when I say triangulation, potentially interviewing participants as well, because while they may have been saying certain things or gesturing in certain ways, there's also things they weren't doing. And discourse then would not capture that, and so that can be a limitation. And then finally, it's often hard to capture complex interactions. So for example, if you have a space where lots of people are talking over each other, that's hard to really frame into a transcript because you have multiple voices occurring at the same time, and how do you represent that? Or if you're in a space like, I mean, this is a kind of maybe a non-educational example, but like at a cocktail party where there's multiple conversations all happening at once, what do you focus on? So if you think about it in the classroom, let's say you have 4 guided reading groups going on. I mean, you could have recorders at 4 different groups, and that's possible, but let's say it's a different educational type of task where the students are doing think pair shares, for example. How do you capture 15 pairs of talk at a table or something like that? So those are some other things that we want to think about in terms of advantages and disadvantages. So finally, as you're reading the chapter by Florio Romain and Ernest Morel, and as you're reading one of the exemplar cases, I want you to think about 3 things. 1, how rigorous was the study described? So how much care did the authors take to really get at how they conducted the discourse analysis? So that we know it's not just, well, I did some random recordings and analyzed what kids say, but there was a very systematic approach towards the study of language and use. Second, what can we learn from discourse analysis that applies to your teaching? So as opposed to ethnography, as opposed to case study, what do discourse analysis studies, what do they contribute to your understanding about language and literacy? And then something always in terms of your more critical analysis is, what other ways could one possibly investigate the phenomenon being described? So instead of discourse analysis, what if they did a case study? Instead of discourse analysis, what if they did an ethnography? What would have been gained or lost by doing those different methodologies? So that's just a brief introduction to discourse analysis, and good luck with the readings, and we'll see you on the discussion board.